Lecture 37, Unconscious Mental Life. So far in this course, we focused mostly on the principles that govern conscious mental life: conscious sensation and perception, conscious learning and memory, conscious thinking and communicating, conscious feeling, conscious desires. And that leads us to raise the question of whether there are aspects of mental life of which we're not consciously aware. What does it mean? Does it mean anything at all to say we have unconscious thoughts, percepts, memories, feelings, and desires? Some psychologists have rejected the notion of unconscious mental life out of hand as a contradiction in terms. For them, having a mind and being conscious are pretty much one and the same thing. But others have suggested that there might be more to mental life than we're consciously aware of. Writing before the advent of scientific psychology, Immanuel Kant thought that it might very well be possible to have ideas yet not be conscious of them, and that we could become aware indirectly of these unconscious ideas by observing their effects on our experience, thought, and action. But first, before we start talking seriously about unconscious mental life, let's be clear on what we mean by consciousness. Consciousness entails two somewhat different things. First, monitoring ourselves and our environment so that percepts and memories, thoughts, feelings, and desires come to be accurately represented in our phenomenal awareness. Second, controlling ourselves and our environment so that we are able to voluntarily initiate and terminate behavioral and cognitive activities. To be able to voluntarily control not just what we do in our behavior, but also what we think and what we feel and what we want. Conscious awareness and conscious control are two different things, but they're obviously related, because it would seem to be difficult, if not impossible, to consciously control something that we're not consciously aware of. Now, we've already seen, back in the lectures on short-term and working memory and attention, one aspect of unconscious mental life, which has to do with the distinction between automatic and controlled processes. You'll remember that automatic processes are inevitably evoked by the appearance of some stimulus in the environment. Once evoked, they run incorrigibly to completion. They cannot be stopped. They are executed efficiently in the sense that they consume little or no cognitive resources. And they can be processed in parallel, which means that they don't interfere with other ongoing mental activities. Controlled processing is often identified with conscious processing. We're aware of what we're doing, and we can control it voluntarily. Automatic processing, by contrast, seems to be unconscious in the strict sense of the term. Automatic processes operate outside of our phenomenal awareness, and they also operate outside of our voluntary control. In a sense, automatic processes are exemplified by the unconscious inferences that Helmholtz thought lay at the root of perception. So, for example, the relative distance of two objects from the observer can be inferred from the relative differences in the size of the images that the objects cast on the retina. We make this inference by employing the size-distance rule, that distance is an inverse function of the size of the retinal image. But we're not conscious of making this inference. The inference is made automatically by our visual system. More broadly, the idea is that automatic, unconscious processes are responsible for generating conscious mental contents. Our conscious sensations, percepts, and memories, our conscious thoughts, feelings, and desires. These are to a large extent generated by these unconscious automatic processes. So automatic processes can be evoked by conscious thoughts and feelings, and they can create conscious thoughts and feelings. The next question is, can thoughts and feelings themselves be unconscious? Apparently, the answer is yes. Less than 100 years after Immanuel Kant raised the question of whether unconscious ideas were possible, Peirce and Jastrow showed that they in fact existed in their experiments on subliminal perception. You'll remember that in these experiments, subjects were asked to identify which of two stimuli were the brighter or the heavier, and then the difference between the stimuli was systematically reduced until the subjects could not consciously detect a difference any longer. Yet when forced to choose which stimulus was the brighter or the heavier, they were right significantly more often than we'd expect by chance. They were not consciously aware of the difference between the two stimuli, but that difference registered in their sensory system somehow and affected their choices, their guesses, outside of conscious awareness. In modern psychology, initial evidence for the existence of unconscious mental contents, as opposed to unconscious mental processes, was provided by laboratory studies of patients with the amnesic syndrome caused by bilateral damage to the hippocampus and other structures in the medial portion of the temporal lobes. We discussed earlier the pioneering study by two British psychologists, Elizabeth Warrington and Lawrence Weisskranz, in which amnesic patients studied a list of words and then received tests of free recall and recognition. Compared to the control subjects, the amnesic patients were much less likely to produce the items from the studied lists on those tests. And that's pretty much the definition of amnesia, an inability to consciously remember events from the past. However, when presented with word fragments or word stems and asked to guess the corresponding word, amnesic patients were much more likely to respond with list items. In fact, their performance on the completion test was no different from that of controls. This is known as a priming effect. Apparently, studying the word list left a trace in memory. The amnesic patients didn't have conscious access to that memory trace, which is why they performed so poorly on tests of free recall and recognition. But traces of the studied words had been encoded anyway and remained in storage, and were able to influence the amnesic patient's performance on the stem and fragment completion tests. Priming shows that some memory of the items encountered in the study phase was retained, despite the patient's failure of conscious recall and recognition. Based on results such as these, Daniel Schachter and his colleagues have distinguished between two expressions of memory, explicit and implicit. Explicit memory refers to conscious recollection of a past event, as indicated by performance on recall or recognition tasks. Implicit memory refers to the effect of a past event on some task that does not require conscious recollection, like priming effects. Implicit memory refers to any effect of a past event on the individual's experience, thought, or action. And the point of the amnesia experiment is that it shows that implicit memory can be preserved even when explicit memory is grossly impaired. Implicit memory can be spared even in the absence of conscious recollection. Subsequent research has confirmed the essential findings of Warrington and Weisskranz, that explicit, conscious, and implicit, unconscious memory can be dissociated in the amnesic syndrome. That is to say, implicit memory occurs in the absence of explicit memory. But this dissociation between explicit and implicit memory has also been observed in a wide variety of other conditions. For example, the amnesia that occurs as an incidental byproduct of electroconvulsive therapy in the treatment of depression. Implicit memory is also preserved for information presented during surgery under general anesthesia, and also during conscious sedation, another procedure often used in outpatient office procedures. Some dementing illnesses, like Alzheimer's disease, profoundly affect explicit memory, but leave implicit memory intact, at least in the early stages of the illness. And mental patients with various forms of dissociative disorder, like psychogenic amnesia, fugue, or multiple personality disorder, will often show priming effects created by past events which they can't consciously recollect. In post-hypnotic amnesia, hypnotized subjects come out of hypnosis and can't remember the things they did or experienced while they were hypnotized. Yet they'll show priming effects for a list of words that they studied while they were in that state. Dissociations between explicit and implicit memory can also be observed in normal memory. For example, memory problems are a feature of normal aging, but they affect explicit memory much more than implicit memory. We don't know much about implicit memory in young children, but the evidence suggests that they display implicit memory before they have the capacity for conscious recollection. Finally, explicit and implicit memory can be dissociated even in an ordinary verbal learning experiment. For example, explicit memory is profoundly affected by the level of processing received by an item at the time of encoding, what I call the elaboration principle. But implicit memory is much less affected by this manipulation. In all these cases, implicit memory is unconscious memory. It's a mental representation of past experience stored in memory, which influences the person's ongoing experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious recollection. Just as implicit memory refers to the influence of past events that cannot be consciously remembered, so implicit perception refers to the influence of events in the current stimulus environment that cannot be consciously perceived. Explicit perception is conscious perception, as exemplified by our ability to consciously detect a stimulus in the environment, to perceive its distance, motion, or form, or to identify the object and to categorize it. Implicit perception, by analogy with implicit memory, refers to any effect of a current event, an event in the current stimulus environment, on the individual's experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious perception. Implicit perception includes cases of so-called subliminal perception, as in the Peirce-Jastrow experiment, and many experiments like it that have been done in more than a century since then. Implicit perception is also implicated in research on what is known as masked priming. In masking, stimuli are presented at intensities that would normally be sufficient to allow them to be perceived under ordinary circumstances. This is different from the Peirce-Jastrow case, where the stimuli were presented at intensities that were too low to be consciously perceived. So the stimuli themselves are nominally supraliminal, above the threshold for conscious perception. But they're followed by a masking stimulus that effectively renders them invisible. This masking stimulus is typically a visual pattern like a string of hash marks. In a famous experiment, Anthony Marcel of Cambridge University carried out a series of studies of masked semantic priming in which words like doctor facilitated lexical decisions of semantically related targets like nurse. All the subjects had to do was to determine whether a letter string like N-U-R-S-E was a legal English word. Now ordinarily, you'd think that this was no big deal, because doctor and nurse are semantically related, and so presentation of one would be expected to prime processing of the other. But because of the masking stimulus, the subjects were not consciously aware of the prime. They were not consciously aware of the word doctor. Yet the word was perceived unconsciously. And we know it was perceived unconsciously because masked presentation of the word doctor primed the processing of the semantically related word nurse. So implicit perception goes beyond merely subliminal perception, and it goes beyond the simple question of whether a stimulus is detectable. In the Marcel experiment, the subjects were actually reading words and understanding them, analyzing them for meaning, despite the fact that they weren't consciously aware of the words. Masked semantic priming gives very good evidence for implicit perception, for unconscious perception. As was the case with memory, it's now understood that explicit and implicit perception, conscious and unconscious perception, can be dissociated in a wide variety of conditions. We've already talked about so-called subliminal perception, and also masked priming, as in the Marcel experiment. The priming that occurs for stimuli presented during general anesthesia could easily be thought of as an example of implicit perception because, of course, an adequately anesthetized patient isn't aware of anything that's going on at the time it's happening. Implicit perception has also been shown to be preserved in a number of neurological syndromes like blind sight, visual neglect, and prosopagnosia, where patients don't have the conscious experience of seeing or perceiving, but are still able to respond appropriately to a perceptual stimulus. Blind sight patients have damage to area V1, the primary visual cortex. They don't consciously see anything in some region of space, yet they can make decisions at levels better than chance about whether there's an object present in the environment, whether it's moving or stationary, and in some cases even what the form of the object is. In visual neglect, patients with another form of brain damage appear not to see. They appear not to be attentive to stimuli that are present in one half of their visual field, typically the left half. Yet careful testing shows that they're responsive to features of those stimuli, even though they're not paying any attention to them and don't really see them. Patients with prosopagnosia can't recognize the faces of people who ought to be familiar to them, whether it's their spouses or their children or the president. Yet if you measure their physiological responses to these faces, you'll see that they respond physiologically in a different manner to objectively familiar faces than they do to the faces of people who are completely unknown to them. Conscious perception is impaired in a group of psychiatric disorders known as the conversion disorders, which used to be known as hysteria. Patients claim to be unable to see or hear or feel tactile sensations, despite the fact that there's nothing wrong physically with their sensory systems. Careful testing in such patients often shows that implicit perception is unimpaired. In a somewhat similar manner, hypnotized subjects can receive suggestions for blindness, for deafness, or for tactile anesthesia, after which they don't see or hear or feel things that they're supposed to see or hear or feel. Yet we can show through careful testing, using priming paradigms and other kinds of procedures, that they're actually responsive to these stimuli outside of conscious awareness. Implicit perception is preserved when stimuli are presented to normal subjects, subjects who are neurologically intact and don't have any kind of psychiatric disorder, but the stimuli are presented outside the field of attention. In parafoveal vision and dichotic listening, we can get priming effects even though the subjects are not consciously attending to stimuli that are presented outside the field of their attention. You can also get these effects even when subjects are paying attention to the very field in which the stimulus is presented. They're just not paying attention to that particular stimulus. These phenomena are collectively known as cognitive blindness. Inattentional blindness is exemplified by a selective looking experiment in which subjects who were paying attention to a ball game failed to notice a man in a gorilla suit walking across the court. Similar lapses of attention occur under conditions of rapid serial visual presentation. In repetition blindness, subjects fail to notice that a stimulus has been repeated. In the attentional blink, they fail to notice a stimulus presented immediately after one that they've detected. In change blindness, they don't notice that a stimulus has been altered. Even so, in at least some of these instances, subjects will show priming effects indicating that the unnoticed events have been processed outside the scope of conscious attention. So in a wide variety of conditions, people are found to be responsive. They show priming effects and other kinds of responses to stimuli of which they're not consciously aware. That's the essence of implicit or unconscious perception. Apparently, subjects can also learn unconsciously, in the sense that new semantic and procedural knowledge acquired through experience can affect their ongoing behavior without their being aware of what they've learned, or even the fact that they've learned anything at all. Again, paralleling the definition of explicit and implicit memory, we can define explicit learning as the person's conscious access to knowledge that he or she has acquired through experience. Whether that knowledge is semantic knowledge, like the meanings of words or some historical fact, or procedural knowledge, some skill or rule that's been learned. Implicit learning refers to any effect of this new knowledge, acquired through experience, on the person's experience, thought, or action, even though the person has no conscious awareness of that knowledge. Here's an example. In a series of studies, Arthur Reber asked his subjects to memorize strings of letters which were generated by a sort of grammatical rule, which specified which letters can appear in the string, how many times, and in what order. But the subjects weren't informed of the existence of these grammatical rules. They were just asked to memorize the letters. After reaching a criterion of learning, that is, they were able to repeat the letter strings back to Reber, the subjects were informed that they had been generated by a grammar, by a set of rules. They were then asked to discriminate between new letter strings, which were also generated by the same grammar, and others that were not. Reber found that his subjects were able to make this distinction between grammatical and ungrammatical letter strings reliably above chance. But when asked, they were unable to tell him what the grammar was. They had obviously learned the grammar, at least to some extent, through their exposure to the letter strings. And they were able to use this knowledge to distinguish between grammatical strings and ungrammatical strings, but they were unable to specify what the grammatical rules were. They acquired new knowledge of the grammar, and that knowledge affected their behavior, but they had no conscious access to the knowledge that they had acquired through experience. Reber's experiments showed that subjects could unconsciously learn a fairly complex artificial grammar. Now, they were certainly aware of memorizing letter strings at the time they were presented to them for study, so this isn't a case of unconscious perception. And they were obviously able to remember the letter strings themselves, so this isn't a case of unconscious memory either. It's a case of unconscious learning. They've acquired knowledge of the grammar through experience, through exposure to grammatical letter strings, but they're not aware of what they've learned. Now, you can think of Reber's artificial grammar test as a kind of categorization task. Subjects are asked to classify strings as grammatical or ungrammatical, and similar findings have been made in other domains of categorization. Subjects are able to classify two objects as similar or as belonging to the same category, even though they're not able to say what that category is or what features are critical for category membership. Subjects are also able to detect the covariation or correlation between two events, picking up on the association between them much in the manner of classical conditioning. They're consciously aware of the two events, but what they're not consciously aware of is the fact that the two events are associated, yet they behave as if they are. They've learned the association between the events, even though they're not consciously aware of that association. Similarly, subjects can pick up information about the sequencing of events, even though when you ask them, they don't think the events are occurring in any particular sequence. And finally, subjects can learn to control complex systems, even though they can't tell you the rule that relates inputs to the system to outputs from the system. In each of these cases, subjects have acquired new knowledge through experience. That's the definition of learning. But they're unaware of the knowledge they've acquired. That's why the learning is implicit or unconscious, not explicit and conscious. And there's also evidence of implicit or unconscious thought, which is particularly surprising because, in a sense, thinking really defines consciousness. When we talk about reasoning and problem solving, making judgments and decisions, we're almost by definition talking about conscious cognitive activity. But it turns out that there is some evidence for implicit thought, where subjects are influenced by ideas, by thoughts that they're not consciously aware of. Here's an example of what I mean. Kenneth Bowers and his colleagues at the University of Waterloo employed a clever variation on a procedure known as the remote associates test. In the remote associates test, subjects are presented with 3 cue words and are asked to generate a 4th word, a target word, that all 3 cues have as a common associate. For example, blank, white, and lines. Take a moment and see if you can think of a word that all three of these words have in common as an associate. That word is paper. There's blank paper and paper with lines on it, and white paper is a technical term in government and diplomacy. Now, what Bowers did was to elaborate the remote associates test into what they called the Dyads of Triads task. In the Dyads of Triads, subjects are presented with two triplets of words, one of which, the coherent triad, is united by a common associate, and the other, the incoherent triad, just isn't. So, blank, white, and lines have the word paper in common, whereas this other triad, still, pages, and music, those three words don't have any associate in common. Now, maybe you can think of one, but as far as the published norms for word association are concerned, there isn't one. Anyway, the task for the subjects was twofold. The first task was to respond with the common associate that unites the coherent triad, to say, paper. But if they couldn't do that within a certain period of time, they were given a second task, which was simply to guess which triad was the coherent one, to guess which triad of words actually had an associate in common. The coherent triads used in the Dyads of Triads test were all soluble, but they were also fairly difficult, so that many otherwise intelligent people with good verbal abilities failed to solve them. Nevertheless, Bowers and his colleagues found that subjects could reliably discriminate between coherent and incoherent triads, even though they could not generate the solution to the coherent triad itself. Much as Peirce and Jastrow found that observers could guess which of two weights were heavier and which of two lights were brighter, even though they could not consciously detect any difference between them. Bowers' subjects were able to guess which triads are coherent and which were incoherent, even when they were unaware of the solution to the coherent set. So the target of the coherent triad, the solution of the problem, is influencing the subject's behavior even though they're not consciously aware of what the solution is, even though they're not consciously aware of the target. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the target is not a percept. It's not as if the word paper is being presented subliminally or in a masked fashion. And it's not a memory either. It's not that the subject saw the word paper earlier in the experiment and later forgot about it. Rather, in this experiment, the mental state that's influencing the subject's performance on the Dyads of Triads isn't a percept, it's not a memory, it's a thought, it's self-generated. But it's a thought of which they're not conscious. It's an implicit thought, not an explicit, conscious thought. The idea of unconscious thought, the idea that implicit thoughts can be dissociated from explicit, conscious thoughts, takes a little while to get your head around, I'll admit. But there's increasing evidence for the idea that implicit and explicit thought can be dissociated. First, there are experiments modeled after the Dyads of Triads paradigm. There's also evidence that presentation of a coherent triad can prime the processing of the target, even though the subjects aren't aware of what the target is. Certain neurological patients with damage to areas of the prefrontal cortex can respond differently to risky choices as opposed to safe choices. Risky choices meaning that there's a low probability of success. Safe choices where there's a high probability of success, even though they're not consciously aware of the probabilities involved. Again, they do seem to have a representation of the probabilities, but they're not consciously aware of that representation. And children can show something like implicit thought in experiments on insight learning. If you give young children a series of problems, all of which can be solved the same way, you can show by decreases in the amount of time it takes them to solve each successive problem that they've got it, even though, when you ask them, they'll tell you that they don't know what the strategy is. They're using a strategy to solve problems that they don't know they're using, because they don't know they have the strategy. The implicit thoughts revealed by Bowers' experiments with the Dyads of Triads procedure seem to have a lot in common with intuition. Those times when something just rings a bell, or it just seems right, even though we can't exactly say why that's the case. These intuitive feelings, in turn, seem to be related to the stages of thought described by Wallace. Preparation includes the accumulation of knowledge and the mastery of the rules which govern the particular domain in which some problem resides. And it also includes the adoption of a problem-solving attitude, including the awareness that there is a problem to be solved and the deliberate, conscious analysis of the problem itself. If it seems the problem can be solved with a well-known algorithm, then the problem may just be solved at this point, and the thinker goes right to the verification stage, which I'll discuss later. Otherwise, the thinker needs to work actively on the problem. But if the problem is very difficult, the thinker may give up, or at least take a break. And here's where things get interesting. Wallace proposed that the preparation stage is followed by a stage he called incubation, in which the thinker is no longer consciously thinking about the problem. He's turned his attention somewhere else, or even gone to bed. But in Wallace's view, problem-solving activity goes on anyway, outside of conscious awareness. If the problem solver is lucky, incubation is followed by intimation, a state of rising consciousness which indicates that a fully conscious flash of success is coming. The intimation stage is otherwise known as intuition. Then there's the illumination stage, in which the solution to the problem appears in the consciousness of the thinker. This is a stage that we might want to call insight. And finally, the verification stage, in which the solution, however it's been arrived at, is confirmed and refined or shown to be incorrect, in which case the problem solver returns to the preparation stage. Incubation, or unconscious problem solving, plays an important role in the folklore of problem solving, but it's also one of the most controversial topics in the literature on thinking and reasoning. There are a lot of instances where scientists and artists of various kinds have claimed to be confronted by some problem that appears to be insoluble. They set the problem aside for a while, and then all of a sudden, the solution to the problem appears in a flash. It's as if they've been working on it unconsciously all that time. On the other hand, many researchers and theorists deny that it occurs at all, and so far research hasn't decisively settled the issue. In principle, however, incubation is the stage in which the solution to a problem is coming into consciousness, but it hasn't yet arrived. But intuition appears to be what's going on in Bauer's Dyads of Triads task. The solution to the coherent triad, the target of the problem, has not yet risen to the level of conscious awareness. But unconsciously, it influences the subject's ability to discriminate between coherent and incoherent triads, as well as the subject's performance on other kinds of tasks. Intuitions arise in the period of incubation, and persist there as well until they emerge into consciousness in the form of a full-blown insight. Now, these intuitive feelings are also controversial, and some theorists argue that they're misleading more often than not, and other theorists believe that too much conscious thought can actually make for bad decision-making, and that people are better relying on their automatically generated unconscious intuitions. But in Wallace's stages of thought, we can see two different aspects of unconscious thinking. Incubation, where it appears that thinking itself goes on outside of conscious awareness, but the solution is not yet accessible to consciousness, and intuition, where the solution influences problem-solving behavior even though the solution has not yet appeared in the form of a full-blown conscious insight. So that's our first view of unconscious mental life. What I have called the cognitive unconscious consists, in the first place, of automatic processes evoked in the course of perceiving and learning, remembering and thinking. These automatic processes are unconscious because they operate outside of our conscious awareness and also outside of our conscious control. And second, we have documented dissociations between explicit and implicit perception, memory, learning, and thought. Implicit percepts influence our experience, thought, and action in the absence of conscious awareness of the stimuli in our environment. Implicit memories influence our experience, thought, and action in the absence of conscious recollection of some event in the past. In implicit learning, we employ knowledge acquired through experience without being consciously aware of what that knowledge is. And in implicit thought, our experience, thought, and action is influenced by ideas which are not themselves either percepts or memories, even though we're not aware of what these ideas are. To have ideas and yet not be conscious of them, there seems to be a contradiction in that, for how can we know that we have them if we are not conscious of them? That's what Kant wrote at the end of the 18th century. He also wrote, "Nevertheless, we may become aware indirectly that we have an idea, even though we are not directly cognizant of the same." That indirect influence comes in the form of priming effects and other effects that reveal implicit perception, memory, learning, and thought. But of course, cognition isn't all there is to the mind. What about emotion? What about motivation? Can our feelings and desires affect our experience, thought, and action, even though we're not aware of them? Certainly, our feelings and desires can be generated by unconscious automatic processes, but in that case we'd still be aware of what we feel and of what we desire. As in the case of unconscious cognition, the really interesting question is whether we can have feelings and desires the way we have ideas, and yet not be conscious of them. Work on unconscious emotion and unconscious motivation is not nearly as advanced as work on unconscious cognition. But still, there are reasons for thinking that we have unconscious feelings and unconscious desires, the same way we have unconscious ideas. Again, by analogy to implicit memory, we can define implicit motivation as any effect on experience, thought, or action that is attributable to the individual's motivational state in the absence of the person's conscious awareness of that motivational state. This contrasts with explicit motivation, which entails the person's conscious awareness of his or her desires, drives, wants, needs, and goals. People's explicit or conscious motives are typically assessed by means of standard personality questionnaires. If somebody endorses questionnaire items like, "I enjoy the challenge of a difficult task," or "I maintain high standards in everything I do," or "I have a strong desire to excel," we can be pretty sure that they have a high level of achievement motivation. And we can be pretty sure that they know it, they're consciously aware of it. By contrast, implicit motives are commonly assessed through the subject's performance on a test known as the Thematic Apperception Test, sometimes called the picture story exercise. In this procedure, the subject is presented with a picture that's somewhat ambiguous and is asked to tell a story about it. A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that talks about what the protagonists, the main figures in the picture, are thinking. These stories are then coded for imagery that's relevant to such motives as achievement, power, affiliation, or intimacy, or whatever motive the investigator is interested in. So, for example, is the child being made to practice and doesn't like it? Or is he thinking about having a career as a concert violinist? Is the acrobat afraid? Or is he confidently about to perform before the crowned heads of Europe? One thing we know for sure is that assessments of motives by means of the Thematic Apperception Test or the picture story exercise do not relate strongly to assessments of the same motives by means of questionnaires. Ordinarily, we'd expect two tests assessing the same personality trait, like the need for achievement, to correlate highly with each other, correlation coefficients in the 60s or 70s or even 80s. By contrast, the correlation between Thematic Apperception Test measures of achievement motivation and questionnaire measures of achievement motivation are near zero. The implication is that someone can score high on an implicit assessment of achievement motivation, but score low on a questionnaire measure. In that case, we might want to say the person really is motivated to achieve, he just doesn't know it. He just doesn't consciously present himself that way or perceive himself that way. Similar findings have been obtained with respect to the need for power or dominance, and also the need for affiliation. The fact that ostensible measures of explicit and implicit motives are so poorly correlated with each other doesn't by itself prove anything, but it does suggest that people's behavior may be driven by motives of which they themselves are not aware. Similarly, Peter Lang's multiple systems theory of emotion suggests that we may be able to dissociate implicit unconscious emotion from explicit conscious emotion. Recall that Lang's theory asserts that there are three different components to every emotional response: a verbal cognitive component representing the subjective experience of emotion, overt motor behavior, and covert physiological activity. Ordinarily, we think of these three components as going together, as co-varying. But in principle, they could be dissociated from each other. If there's a disruption in the verbal cognitive system underlying the subjective experience of emotion, a person might be unaware of being in an emotional state, but he still might behave as if he is in an emotional state in terms of his overt motor behavior or his covert physiological activity. We sometimes see this in the treatment of phobias, where after treatment a person may say he's not afraid of something that he used to be afraid of, but still he'll tend to avoid it, and his heart will start pounding when he encounters it. This dissociation is known as a desynchrony among the components of emotion. In this sense, and again by analogy to implicit memory, we can define explicit emotion as the person's subjective mood state, subjective affective response or feeling state, and implicit emotion as any effect on the person's experience, thought, or action that's attributable to the individual's emotional state, even in the absence of the person's conscious awareness of that emotional state. And again, these effects are most likely to be seen either in terms of the person's overt motor responses, like facial expressions, or covert physiological responses, such as might be measured in the autonomic nervous system. Lang's multiple systems theory of emotion predicts that there might be dissociations between conscious and unconscious emotion. And Joseph Ledoux's neuroscientific theory of emotion suggests that such dissociations could in fact happen. If, for example, the brain module that mediates the verbal cognitive component of emotion is damaged somehow, but the brain modules that mediate the overt and covert components of emotion remain intact. So it can all work out in theory, but it would be nice to have a little bit of evidence. Some evidence along these lines comes from research on social attitudes, how whites feel about blacks, how men feel about women, and vice versa. Traditionally, attitudes are measured simply by asking subjects whether they like or dislike something, or how much. These measurements would represent conscious or explicit attitudes. More recently, some social psychologists have tried to measure implicit or unconscious attitudes as well. For example, the implicit association test employs reaction time to measure the amount of time it takes to judge whether something is good or bad. A number of studies have shown that implicit attitudes, so measured, do not correlate very highly with explicit attitudes as measured by self-report. Whether that means that the attitudes tapped by the IAT are truly unconscious, or whether the subjects simply were reluctant to divulge their true attitudes on the explicit measure isn't completely clear yet, but it's a start. Although the research I've just described gives us sufficient reason for taking unconscious mental life seriously, it has to be said that the evidence in each of these domains is not equally strong. I think that the evidence for implicit perception and implicit memory is quite convincing, establishing the existence of unconscious percepts and memories to the satisfaction of all but a very few critics. Implicit learning is also very widely accepted, although a little more controversial. Evidence for implicit thought is on somewhat softer ground, but only because there have been relatively few studies in this domain compared to perception, memory, and learning. The same holds true for unconscious motives and unconscious emotions. research in these domains is just getting off the ground. Writing in his Principles of Psychology more than 100 years ago, when scientific psychology was still in its infancy, William James warned that the unconscious was the sovereign means for believing what one likes in psychology, and of turning what might become a science into a tumbling ground for whimsies. It's all too easy for us as psychologists, or even as ordinary people on the street, to tell people what they unconsciously believe or think or feel or want. How could they possibly contradict this? But studies of automatically controlled processes and of explicit and implicit perception, memory, learning, and the like offer a solution to James's warning, because they offer strict criteria for identifying unconscious mental processes and unconscious mental states, and for making inferences about subjects' unconscious mental lives, by tying these inferences to objective evidence of behavior in the controlled environment of the laboratory. The result is that we can now talk about the unconscious in a scientifically respectable way, and proceed to discover its scope and limitations, and identify neural correlates of both conscious and unconscious mental life through the usual sorts of laboratory research.